I'm Michael Wall, I'm the chair of the Irish Georgian Society. I'm a barrister who used to practice in judicial review, but I moved on, but I'm also an architect and planner, so I'm some understanding of what's happened today, which has been an extraordinary event really in terms of the positives and the negatives, the crisis and the opportunity. But normally the last session of the conference can be called the graveyard shift, but this is not the case here. This is about positivity and engagement in action, and hopefully hope as well. So our first speaker, Alistair MacDonald, planner. I shan't go through his CV, it's in your brochure. I'll give Alistair a lot of time to tell us about engagement in action. Thank you very much, Alistair.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for that warm welcome. I am a town planner by background. Unfortunately, unlike the last three speakers, I'm not a doctor, so apologies for that. But I am, maybe perhaps slightly differently to the talk we just had, which is obviously some real challenges within the system. I guess I would also say I'm an optimist as well, and I think this presentation I'm about to give is very much about optimism for the future, as Michael said. Just a very quick word about our background as a practice. So Allies and Morrison, so you might know us as a design studio. We have a London base, but we also have a small Dublin studio. We actually undertook our first project in Dublin about 30 years ago, which was the British Embassy. And we're currently working on a master plan for Trinity College. So it's, that 30-year period has been a really exciting process for us in getting involved in Dublin. I'm actually, as I said, a planner by background, so as part of our team, which are planners, urban designers, so I'm here representing that part of the practice today. And a lot of the work we do is very focused on engagement, as you see from these photos, and this is some of the work we did in Stratford, in London, and recently we've been working very closely with a number of local authorities on the west coast, actually, of Ireland, and it felt quite strange to us in a way to be coming to Dublin to talk about some fairly provincial locations, but actually the process that we've been undertaking there, particularly around Town Centre First and Thrive, which is something that was introduced this morning, and Nicola spoke quite a bit about New European Bauhaus in particular. There's some really good lessons, we think, and things which might well have a place within the big city, but also within the planning system looking forwards. So as I said, there's three main types of project we've been working on recently, which we wanted to share some updates around really. So firstly, Town Centre First plans, and there were a slew of these, I think kind of 2021, 2022, sort of post-pandemic, and those responded very much to the Town Centre First policy initiatives. The second batch of projects we've been looking at are integrated urban strategies, and those relate very much to this world of Thrive. The Town Centre First plans or integrated urban strategies are fairly similar. They're not statutory planning policy documents. They're not going to allocate housing, but they are very much focusing on local character, local context, and heritage in particular in the case of the integrated urban strategies. And so today I'll be talking a bit about Carrick on Shannon, Ennis Town Centre, and also Tralee, which are three current Thrive projects we've been looking at recently. We're also in the midst of doing work in the west end of Galway, and also Carrow Row in Connemara, and Salt Hill in Galway as well. So it's very interesting to hear Jim's presentation earlier around the challenges in Galway in particular. And those aren't Thrive projects, that last batch, but they do have common themes, both in terms of the emphasis on engagement, but also thinking about the role of the historic environment and celebrating that character. So today I'm going to quickly rehearse some of the background to Town Centre First and a bit more on New European Bauhaus. Thank you again to Nicola for introducing that and allowing me to speak a lot less about New European Bauhaus today. And then we'll talk through some case studies and then some lessons learned towards the end as well. And as Michael said, there's definitely a kind of emphasis on optimism and how we might draw on some of this type of work. Looking forward. So Town Centre First, as you're probably aware, obviously sits within the national planning framework, big emphasis on towns and villages, town centre regeneration, economic growth and compact growth, and then placemaking in particular being important, and co-production. We heard quite a lot about that this morning, about co-production. And so in Town Centre First project there's a town team which tends to be made up of businesses, local residents and stakeholders, and they're part and parcel of the process of developing the plan. And for all of these projects we're talking about now, there's been a stage, usually 2 or 3 stages, or 4 or 5 stages in some cases of engagement, and really not necessarily trying to do things in a high-tech way, but actually just getting out and speaking to people is often we found is the most successful way of doing these things. Town Centre First and Thrive also have a big emphasis on delivery. There's a big emphasis on firstly identifying the strategies, but then also defining projects which could be funded and delivered. And as I'll come on to, we think that's important because members of the public turn up at a workshop, they talk about something, they then hear, several weeks later, they hear how you've taken that on board and created a project. And in the case of Thrive, it's then actually putting forward funding bids for those projects. So we think it's a really good model because it gives people a sense of progress. And I think there is sometimes frustration with the planning system that, comments kind of disappear off into the void. And you hope that you're going to see that come back as a project or a new direction in the future, but it could be, potentially, particularly with statutory plan making, that could take several years. So these projects, being non-statutory, do give the advantage of being able to move very, very quickly. So a few nice images from, whenever we come to Ireland as well, it's always a sunny day as well, so I will try and guarantee that when I come from London next time for you as well, and indeed today it is as well. But value-based planning, as we said, is important. So a couple of familiar images from Nicola's presentation earlier. So the Compass document, which is a really good, accessible way into European Bauhaus, if you've not come across it before. This diagram on the right-hand side. So there's 3 colour tones: sustainable, beautiful, and together. And beauty came up a lot. It was really interesting to hear Paul's thoughts on kind of the quantitative side of how you might evaluate beauty earlier. But those really are the outcomes that the Bauhaus seeks to achieve for individual projects. So those, I think, to this audience, I think all of you would think, well, that's a no-brainer. But it's important to say it, and it's important to set that narrative up on projects, and we think that does make a difference. And I think explaining that to the audience that you're working with, and that might include council members, it might include members of the public, it might include businesses, that's actually quite a powerful thing to do at the outset. And then the 3 grey lines really describe the process, the ways in which you would generate the project. So the importance of participation, multi-level engagement, and a transdisciplinary approach. So all of that adds up to being very collaborative, thinking about the world of co-production, but also working with a design team, which is not just planners or not just designers, it's including the right specialists for the job, and then for those specialists to actually have direct involvement with the community. So that process is particularly important in terms of Thrive. It also feels like it was relevant to Town Centre First, even if it perhaps wasn't such a big kind of named concept at that point. And we just wanted to talk through Thrive very quickly as well. So the Thrive initiative is about transforming town centres using revitalised publicly owned heritage buildings. There's quite a big focus on repurposing these buildings for community assets and obviously focusing on sustainability and the active involvement of the community. Co-funded by the government and the European Union, and interestingly, again, coming from London today, these sorts of projects which used to exist and used to be so successful and so important don't now exist in the same way, and that funding stream is really important that still exists here. Community-led approach to planning, design and project selection, and so there's a little diagram in a moment, but either, in order to do a Thrive bid for an individual building, you either need to have a Town Centre First plan or you need to have an integrated urban strategy, but there is a strategic basis for the project. It's not just been plucked out of the air, it needs to sit within a context. And then also thinking about the importance, and I think this came up several times, the importance of celebrating and preserving architectural and cultural heritage through these projects. So this diagram is really just trying to emphasise the kind of relationships. So as you would expect, there's a kind of strong hierarchy running through from national to regional to local through the planning policies. So the Thrive work, the Town Centre First plans aren't replacing development plans. Development plans are there, that's where growth locations are decided. So in some ways it's very easy for me to say Thrive is a great thing because it's kind of a good news story for the community. When you're talking to the community about where 10,000 homes might go on the edge of their settlement, that's always not such a good news story. And if you're working for the local authority, that's a tricky thing. So integrated urban strategies and town centre first plans, they don't have that remit. So you are focusing on, perhaps the kind of easier, more joyful elements of the planning process around public spaces, around streets, around character, around historic buildings. So you should be onto a bit of a winner there, really, in terms of that engagement with local people. So as I said, town centre first plans through either that or an integrated urban strategy. And then those plans will generally define a series of kind of package projects which could then be taken forward, and those might relate to things like public realm improvements, they might relate to addressing vacancy, it might be things like living over the shop, as we heard this morning, it might be historic buildings for renovation, and it might also be kind of wider design guidance or area-based mechanisms for improving specific historic parts of the town centres. So within the Thrive projects that we're going to talk through, there's obviously one of those projects gets selected, and then that gets taken forward. So there'll need to be a Part A application for that building, and then that building is then, hopefully with the benefit of a consent, and then gets taken forward as a Thrive Strand 2 application. So the examples I'm using today are all very, very live. Two of them have actually got live Part 8s at the moment. The other one has just been consented, and two of them have recently gone in for Thrive funding bids as well. And it's the regional assemblies that determine those applications, I should mention as well. So we think generally the experience of producing these has been very positive. I've been involved personally in 2 out of these 3 projects, and we've had councillors come up to us, or members of the public come up to us afterwards and say, that's one of the most interesting presentations I've had about this place. It was really positive. You were talking about the historic environment. And we just think it's a very, very solid way of working with the community to actually achieve better planning guidance outcomes. So the first is Carrick-on-Shannon, and so this was a town centre first plan a couple of years ago. There's a big emphasis on connecting to the Shannon and basically repurposing spaces, reclaiming some of those spaces so there is a better engagement and indeed some biodiversity improvements as well as part of that. And the specific building that was then selected was the town hall, and this building has kind of gone through many different uses over the years, and that's actually quite a common trait with these historic buildings, is that there's been many different commercial or community operations that have happened in them over time. They've often not been entirely successful, and so this is now a good opportunity to perhaps revisit and then repurpose and bring up to kind of modern standards whilst retaining that character. So that's the back of the building there. I should also say that all 3 of these projects involve a collaboration between ourselves. So we were Allies and Morrison, better known as architects, but we were working on this as planners and urban designers. And actually A2 architects, so Peter Carroll, that I'm sure some of you in the room will know, A2 were actually leading on the actual design work for the Part 8s themselves. And then we had other specialist consultants as necessary on the team. So the town hall was very much about bringing it back into kind of functional use as a multi-purpose community space. There's also creating a new garden area to the rear. And the common factor with all of these projects is firstly taking care of the historic fabric properly, also thinking about improvements to accessibility, introducing ramps and changing places, toilets, and just the simple things that you need to make the building work and functional and accessible for the whole community, and then also making improvements to the performance of the building in terms of energy, whether that's better insulation or improving circulation or achieving natural light or better drainage. All those different things have been dealt with comprehensively. So then so this one went in for Part 8, I think about 2 weeks ago. So there's a series of images which just kind of capture the spirit of those proposals. And what the Part 8 process is good because it allows you to think about flexibility of use. So within the Thrive bid, there'll be a business case which actually talks about the specific operations that will go in there, but that doesn't need to go in the Part 8. The Part 8 is very much about thinking about achieving the right quality and the right flexibility. So some really evident images here, thinking back to that photo before of thinking about the quality of the materials on the ground plane, and also obviously improving the fabric of the building itself, thinking about accessibility. A big emphasis in Carrick on actually celebrating the history of the Shannon. So that's kind of example exhibition which might take place in one of the rooms. and then just generally making the space a more welcoming, friendly space which celebrates Carrick. So the building that was actually selected in the end was the Cloister restaurant, which some of you may know. It's right next to the River Fergus. And that building actually is attached, whilst it doesn't look like it from the front, it's actually attached to a national monument. So the Ennis Friary was there, and that's where the agreement to form Ennis as a county was signed. So this building has been in and out of use as nightclubs, restaurants over the years, and it's recently closed. So actually the council are in agreement to actually purchase, subject to the funding bid going through. The council are actually in agreement to purchase this building in the future. So it wasn't publicly owned, but there is the potential for it to come under public control. And within the space itself, you get more of a sense of this connection to the Friary, and it's a really dramatic volume inside. I mean, it's so recently been closed that these are actual beer bottles and wine bottles that are actually on the walls still, but it's a really amazing space, and there's also an external courtyard as well. And this just highlights, so we've got the Cloister building here, and then the Friary here, and obviously there's a kind of connecting wall where it shares a common edge with the River Fergus at the front. So it just is a very, as an individual project, it's a really emblematic location for Ennis itself. And again, the project was very much about coming up with a very flexible Part 8 consent. It's not absolutely fixed in the Part 8 as to exactly what the use will be, but within the business case work that we've been doing, there's a big emphasis on creating art studios and classrooms, so there's a real lack of that sort of space within the town centre. Lots of successful examples of trad music in particular, with Glore being the big one that everyone knows, but again, creating more accessible, welcoming space that can hopefully thrive for 100 years ahead. And also this idea of an art wall. So the exterior of the building could have temporary art installations, which could either be famous local work, it could be national work, or it could indeed be work that school children might have produced. So that was part of enlivening the actual space outside the building as well. So again, that kind of dramatic internal space, which could only be that building really. And we had a brilliant workshop about a month ago where we basically trailed the proposals that had just been consented, and we had a really, really strong response from the community, and a lot of people basically wanting to stay involved in the project and saying, well, I know an artist that lives in North Clare, they'd love to get involved in this. So a big part of the project is not, obviously you get consent, you hopefully get funding, but then the project continues into the future, so it's really important that you kind of tee up the longer term implementation. How am I doing for time? 1 minute, okay. I'm gonna flick through Tralee very quickly. So Tralee was the final one, similar sort of emphasis in terms of the integrated urban strategy, and then the lucky building there was the Ashton Memorial Hall, which is the county museum. And the proposals there, again working with A2 and also Carol O'Mahony, conservation architect who's based in Dublin as well, was again thinking about how that museum space could be repurposed. The big change would be looking at the roof space in particular, so activating the current vacant mansard attic space, and also creating this really joyful, beautiful space which has the Slieve Marsh mountains behind, which is just a completely different type of space for the town centre, for the museum, but flexibly used by the community. In terms of lessons learned, which I'm going to go through in just over 1 minute, if that's okay. So very much the importance of using historic buildings and this sort of project to encourage positive conversations about planning. It is, to quote a kind of social media term, it's a very relatable topic. People understand it. I think people find it hard sometimes to understand why you're talking about delivering 10,000 homes, but they do find it easier, as soon as you start saying, well, we want to celebrate this place, understand why it's special to you, and actually deliver a project which is part of it. That's very easy for people to buy into. And of course, it's not the place of the planning system to only deal with that, it has to deal with allocations as well. But if heritage could be more within the foreground of that conversation, and this sort of process could be more in the foreground of this kind of process, then we think it would be a really positive move for the planning system. And indeed, if this could be scaled up to think about individual neighbourhoods or groups of buildings or spaces, we think that would be a really positive thing. So whether it's under the banner of Thrive, or whether it's something that's kind of picked up by local authorities or within a different system, we think that would be a great thing. Having a funding deadline always motivates you to move quickly. So some of these projects were 4 to 6 months with 3 or 4 rounds of engagement, so it's very, very fast. So that is a challenging thing for a design team, and it's a very challenging thing for the local authority officers that worked on it. But for the community, they're seeing progress very, very quickly, and have a sense of where you're going very quickly. And that I think responds to a lot of the frustration you sometimes get. Obviously, a Part 8 can only do so much. You typically would have to screen out an SEA or an AA. So it does mean that your projects have to kind of fit within that type of planning process. It's no good if you need to do an environmental impact assessment. So that, given that the historic environment and archaeology can sometimes be very challenging, that is perhaps a limitation. But generally speaking, the response we've had from people is extremely positive, and we do think it's a kind of good template for the future, and hopefully builds capacity, almost within local communities to get involved in historic environments and potentially even get involved in positive conversations about growth as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alistair. It's always challenging on a day like today in terms of coming from the macro to the micro and the complexity of the issues that we have debated and discussed. But it is really good to see a template or something quite positive with local engagement that has applicability beyond the towns in question. So before I introduce my next speaker, this next piece, I call it engagement in action. And there's been a lot of discussion, and obviously the extraordinary topic of lack of leadership, political leadership, and so on. But we have eminent architectural practitioner and conservation architect and recently retired lecturer from UCD, Paul Arnold, who is going to give us an example of public engagement and action. Again, let us hope that this might be inspirational in terms of how things can happen from the bottom up, but things do take some time as well. Paul.
Okay. So it is about, as Michael says, this is about addressing 2 of the topics of this afternoon's conference: housing and citizen engagement, as can be understood through the story of an apartment building in the east of Paris, which was first occupied last September, but it was 12 years in the making. It addresses a number of seemingly gratuitous ambitions in the context of a commodified housing system. Now, I have to advance. The issue is clearly one that is shared between Dublin and Paris and shared over time. If you excuse me giving you a little bit of the geography and history of Paris briefly, the city does straddle a bend in the river Seine, and includes some hills, amongst them the well-known Montmartre and the higher Ménilmontant on the east of the city. And the site is that red dot developed by Utop and faces west over the city. In the 1670s, Louis XIV decided to break with the tradition of his forebears and to leave Paris without a defensive wall. There was, however, a system of tolls on produce entering the city, and the tax collectors, known as Farmers General, erected a timber palisade to control access to the taxable area, but it was found to be satisfactory and permeable. And so in the 1780s, a new substantial wall, known as the Farmer General Wall, with more than 50 toll booths, most designed by Claude Nicolas Ledoux, was erected. The wall was resented by the Parisians, not only because it was highly effective as an instrument of tax collection, but also for the extravagant character of its architecture. The French Revolution of 1789 allowed citizens to express their discontent through the burning of several of the toll booths. Tax collection was suspended by the revolutionaries, but was reinstated in 1798. The effect of taxation was to encourage industry and poorer people to move outside of the grey area, outside of the tax-walled area, However, the occupation of the city by the Allied forces in 1814 gave rise to the idea of a new defensive wall. And in the 1840s it was constructed and it was known as the Tiers Wall. It was comprised of a substantial stone wall with bastions and a clear zone to the exterior known as the zone non edificandi, 375 metres in total breadth. And we'll come back to this because it becomes significant in the context of the talk. Haussmann's remodelling of Paris from 1753 to 1870 addressed the entire area within the Tiers Wall, with main routes addressing the formal gates, creating numerous fine streets and boulevards, but also involved the displacement of many poor inhabitants of the impacted areas. Initially, they found new accommodation between the Tax Wall and the Tiers Wall. In tandem, inward migration from rural France and elsewhere in Europe accelerated. In 1860, the metropolitan area and the taxed area became coextensive, with the number of arrondissements being increased to 20. Industry was given a 5-year derogation to allow time to relocate. The tax on wine led to the creation of ganguettes, as alluded to by Valerie earlier, in the parks and along the riverbanks later in the 19th century outside of the taxed walled city. A circular railway known as the Petit Ceinture was constructed to serve the military needs of the wall, but also served to connect the main railway stations, which had been located on the slightly higher ground away from the floodable area in the city centre. The Petit Ceinture, long disused, passes in a tunnel along the face of the UTOP site. Now, what's happened? There. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 led to a comprehensive French defeat by the Prussians under Bismarck. The Parisian working classes were betrayed or felt betrayed by the Versailles government and established an independent commune in the east of the city, which lasted 2 months, until suppressed by General MacMahon, leading to mass executions and deportations over the next 8 years. The commune and its legacy retains great significance in the 20th arrondissement, and this is a commemorative wall about the executions that took place. Notwithstanding the introduction of a new water supply for Paris in the 1860s and subsequently, there was a demonstrable correlation between poverty and ill health, as depicted in this diagram, where incidence of death from tuberculosis is mapped. Cholera and typhoid were also of concern, and this map is also to be read as a correlation between poor housing and disease, leading to designation of the îlots insalubres, the unhealthy blocks, more succinctly, I think, translated as designated slums. 17 such slums were designated, identified in this map between 1894 and 1927. The UTOP on the site is on the east side of designated slum number 11. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, social housing was provided by philanthropic organisations. And this is a housing scheme in the area, and it was funded by the Laborde family, who also funded the Pasteur Institute and the work of Marie and Pierre Curie. The buildings are often of architectural significance, and they continue in use and are wonderful examples of housing as enduring infrastructure. And there are other projects close to the UTOP site of a comparable value. The destruction of the Tiers Wall after the First World War added about 1,275 hectares to the city, about 1.5 times the size of the Phoenix Park. And that land was used for the provision of 60,000 social houses, as well as sporting and cultural facilities. The administrative structure associated with those buildings essentially became the system for housing in Paris and has continued to evolve as the basis of social housing provision since then. In town planning terms, this development on the periphery was much influenced, although not comprehensively, by Le Corbusier and the 1933 Athens Charter, more ville circonventionnelle than ville radieuse, I think. Le Corbusier developed, a scheme for îlot for designated slum number 6, which is not far from number 11. In the Town Planning Charter of 1933 from Athens, which included Le Corbusier in its formulation, it was advocated that the historic buildings should be safeguarded and built-up areas should be safeguarded, provided that this was in the general interest and that health conditions were achieved. In Le Corbusier's scheme, I think the entire block was to be cleared, and 2 buildings were to be retained in this historic area of the city. The scheme represents Le Corbusier's philosophy concerning the individual and society. In a review from the AJ of 2004, an unidentified contributor writes, Le Corbusier's ville contemporaine and subsequent plans for new cities were not designed to create a more open, communicative society. They were planned so that the individual could be alone, being intellectually creative and in some other way contemplating the spirit. The author suggests that Le Corbusier felt nightclubs, cafes, restaurants and theatres were to be good only for wasting time, swapping germs and fraying nerves. Sport was admitted because its rules were laid out and it was healthy. By reducing commuter time, people had more time to be alone. And the street, the centre of social discourse, was eliminated in favour of the freeway, where one is isolated within the car. So this is very close by. As it is now, Paris is a walking city with a density of 31,000 people per square kilometre, about 6 times that of Dublin City, a density which supports such services as the 1,200 bakeries, with most Parisians living within a 5-minute walk of one. The Second World War delayed implementation of some slum clearances, but the desire to modernise was inexorable. Some designated slums were cleared by burning, sometimes by the authorities, but on a number of occasions by arson with significant loss of life. The city continues to provide new social housing with the ambition to have 30% public housing for low-income residents and 10% for middle-income residents by 2035, 10 years' time. The heterogeneous nature of the architecture of the east of the city allows contemporary architecture to find its place within the urban structure. So, turning to the UTOP development, it's in a way surprising that this is the first such development in the city. There are a number of other comparable projects throughout France. There is a national organisation for cooperative housing, and so far there are 43 completed projects, 29 underway, and 40 at a planning stage. The UTOP building itself is on a corner site and comprises 7 stories over the entrance level, constrained in depth by windows on the flank of an adjoining pre-existing apartment building. It benefits from a small park to the north, east side, and an open aspect to the south and west. The ground floor reflects many of the particular aspirations of the project. More than half of the length of the facade is permeable, leading to some facilities for the broader community, while there is a music practice room, a co-op meeting room, also available for outsiders to use, and equipped as a small cafe and a bicycle store. There is no car parking provision, and the garden is constructed as a small amphitheatre. The front facade is dominated by 2 double-storey windows which illuminate access for the apartments. All circulation areas are daylit, and the rear facade is designed to support greenery. Overall planning terms, normally there are 2 or 3 apartments per floor. The apartments vary in size: a 2-room, 1-bedroom apartment of about 45 square metres with a 9 square metre terrace, or a 55 square metre with no terrace. A studio of 31.5 square metres with a 6 square metre terrace. A 2-bedroom with a 60 square metre area and a 12 square metre terrace, and a 3-bedroom of 73 square metres with no terrace, and ultimately a large 2-bedroom of 71 square metres with a 10 square metre terrace. Within these plans, certain elements will seem particularly curious to Irish designers. There is a single stairs serving the 7-storey building, 7+1 storey building, with winding steps. The stairs has windows at most levels and a smoke vent at the top. There are no fire lobbies. A lot of the bedrooms, nearly all of the bedrooms, are inner rooms. That is to say, they can only be accessed by going through the living room, and each apartment has a bath. There are a number of features which support conviviality. The landing at alternate levels has a small shared space with shoe storage and enough space to allow casual socialising, primarily intended for children. As part of the design process and now the management structure, children formed their own committee. The top floor has a three-bedroom apartment and a communal terrace which is accessed by passing through the laundry room, of which more later. The plan allows for modification and extension of the apartments, either by incorporating the terraces or by colonising an adjoining apartment. So if we look at this plan as it stands at the moment, with 3 apartments, and we can identify the terraces in grey. And one way of modifying this plan is by colonising the central apartment and dividing it and making them 2 larger apartments. Another way of dealing with it is by keeping the 3 apartments and by inhabiting the terraces, which, as you've seen, are actually room-sized to start with, and in fact are wired as rooms. So, what is compelling about the project is that they set out with a very strong philosophy about what they were doing. And I should point out that the people who were involved were essentially a group of musicians who were friends in the area, and so they knew one another quite well. But their objective was to stay in the area and to build affordable housing, which would be available to those eligible for social housing. It was to be anti-speculative. No individual private property was to accrue in the course of this. There was no real estate equity. There was a separation of land, site and building, which emerged during the course of the project. Publicly guaranteed social housing loan was useful, a low initial participation premium and low-tech solutions. And by way of communication, last autumn, when they were inhabiting the building, they had 2 open days. The first day had about 250 architects visiting, and the second day we were there as well. And they made a point of presenting some of these concerns that they had and they addressed in the course of the project, and presented in a very straightforward way. The other aspects that they were dealing with was this concept of living in a house, a home, characterized by solidarity and mutual support, rent levels that correspond to household income at a low level, creating a solidarity fund for unpaid rent, because of course they are the owners of the building and have responsibility for the repayment of the loan, and there is a form of collective ownership. All of this information, a lot of this information is available on the UTOP website, but I'll continue to show a few other concerns that they felt were important in the process. Over the 12 years that they were building it, they needed to work together and they needed to address small issues of power within society and within their organization. And therefore, they were very keen that everybody should learn as much as they could about everything. There weren't to be separate groups of people about different aspects. So it was integrative governance, essentially, that was what they were trying to put together. Decisions were to be made by consent, validated if there were no objections. They understood that it takes time to gain knowledge on the subjects to make an informed decision and to bring everybody to the same level of knowledge, and avoiding private domains and information that doesn't circulate, and that whoever was in charge at a given time was not an authority. All decision making was to be collegiate. By throwing back to Irish history, considering the 3 F's of fair rent, fixity of tenure, and freedom of sale, it is to be understood that the rents align with social housing norms, so they're fair rents. Fixity of tenure, people can stay as long as they like, subject to income limits. But when they do exceed the income limit, they're given 3 years to reduce their income or to move on. They do have nothing to sell. People recover their initial investment, their initial participation fee, and have nothing else, so they can move on. And it seems to me that this is an extraordinary circumstance. So they participate in the design, the procurement and the construction of the dwellings in a location of their own choosing, with no expectation of capital gain. And they benefit from during their own occupancy from tenure and rental advantages. So they're living in a convivial environment, they recognize ownership of use, thank you very much, and they share as much as possible, including the titular laundry room. They're also involved in outreach to the community, and they have a separate organisation, La Pastèque, as a resource for the community. It has received quite a lot of publicity in the Paris press, and this small note, I think, summarises quite well the advantages of doing this. Thank you. So the rents are really very modest, $425 per month, and based on an initial investment of $2,250. And they benefit from a 60-year right of use to start with, because the ground itself was sold by the city to a housing association, not theirs, and they have a 60 years ground rent, which I'm not sure in Ireland are new ground rents achievable or in this context. And as I mentioned, the individuals leave with their own initial investment, and the building remains dedicated to social housing, which itself would probably have been critical in ensuring that the city would underwrite the mortgage. They continue to invest, or they invested in the construction costs of ensuring that they had things to give to the city. So the openness that I mentioned of the ground plan earlier, the shop window for the exhibition, for exhibition purposes, and then the fact that the small gesture of the daylit spaces, provision for shoe storage and so on, and the communal washing facilities, which is the place for sharing of stories, and which fits into a narrative from the 19th century where these lavoirs are constructed throughout France under Napoleon III, and which are understood to be particularly helpful in people sharing information and bonding. Looking very briefly to two other places, people have discussed earlier on today the issue of standards in construction. There are what's called Plex housing in Montreal. 60% of the city is built of row houses that are in shared occupancy. And they're dreadful in the sense of being very poor in terms of acoustic insulation, very poor in terms of thermal insulation, and they are utterly desirable. People like the fact that they are sociable. They live on the street, they live on the terraces, on the balconies, they share access up these dreadful stairs. And so one of my students was looking at this last semester, and it's just very interesting. A lot of research has already been done on it. So this convivial location, convivial approach is really very important. In Zurich, 20% of Zurich's housing for the last 100 years has been not-for-profit, with a further 10% being, with a further 5% being social housing. So virtually all of the non-for-profit housing is cooperatively led. And that means that they now have an installed base of some 75,000 apartments. They're built and run on equity deposits, very much like the one we've been looking at. Below market price apartment rentals are worked out with the goal of covering the expenses of the cooperative. This is from the architectural review from 10 years ago, a bit longer. And these expenses include building servicing, repaying interest on initial loans, and so on. One of the critical things that I understood from the UTOP project, and I think it's the same elsewhere, is that once the initial expenses have been addressed, that a fund is built up that allows the process to be repeated again, and so therefore they're in a position to assist in creating new comparable buildings. So the form of the building is very much in the line, in the nature of comparable buildings in the area. And there is a lot of interest in such houses in the area. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, for that inspirational example. And as you said, just as Gordon said to us earlier today, notwithstanding legislative hurdles and so on, exceptions can be made. And hopefully it's bottom-up solutions might be encouraged in the same way here. Our next speaker is Máire Henry. Máire was a member of Taoiseach's task force, which you described as is a noted architect in the area of regeneration and conservation, and is a vice president of the RIAI. And Paul Kearns, or Dr. Paul James Kearns, earlier spoke about the absence of beauty, but maybe Máire can enlighten us in terms of that there might be underlying beauty within the remit of the task force. Máire, thank you very much.
Thank you. To you for that. Thank you to the Irish Georgian Society and Dublin Civic Trust for organising today's event and for asking me to talk about my involvement in the task force for Dublin City. For those of you who don't know, that's the cover of our report, but the task force was established last May by the then Taoiseach Simon Harris. The objective was to develop a set of recommendations to rejuvenate and revitalise parts of Dublin City. We only had 13 weeks to do our work. This is the cover of the final report, which was launched in the GPO last October. It outlines 10 big actions, 10 big moves as they're called, that we see as interdependent and will lead to more people living in the city, in a healthy city that respects its heritage. It's really important to say that one of the key aims of our group was to add momentum to the already great body of work, reports, policies undertaken by many agencies charged with the guardianship and development of our capital. And many of those agencies and their representatives have spoken here today. We did try to collate most of the relevant reports over the last 20 years to get a better understanding of common recommendations, but more importantly, obstacles to implementation. We've heard it said a lot today, ideas can be easy, but implementing the ideas is very challenging. Given our short time frame, no original research was carried out other than some stakeholder engagement. We were 13 on the task force, representing Dublin City Council, public services, community, business, union, arts, culture, tourism, transport, security, architecture, urbanism, engineering and design. There could have been many more, but that's how we ended up. Our chair was David McRedmond, who's he may be here today. He's CEO of An Post and responsible for one of the most important buildings in our capital, the GPO on O'Connell Street. David was an excellent chair and continues to advocate and lobby for positive transformation. We all recognised very early on, and we met several times in that 13-week for a number of day-long workshops, we recognised that no one discipline or agency can solve Dublin's problems. It requires us all to work together with a restored commitment to the common good, and that word has been brought up by a lot of our speakers today, or public good, as Paul said. Common good over individual preferences. To help steer our work, we aligned behind 3 common missions: more people living in the city, streets that are cleaner and safer, and finally, a healthy, vibrant city that respects its heritage. We didn't put a red line around the area we were asked to look at, but it was loosely around O'Connell Street and the areas that have been addressed today with many of our speakers. As an architect representing the RIAI on the task force, I felt it was my duty to liaise with experts within our own organisation who have been involved either through research or practice in sustainable city transformations. A lot of these colleagues are here today: Charlotte, Grania, David, Jim, Kieran Cuff, and many others. I also consulted with our committees in housing, urbanism, and historic buildings, and a number of practitioners who are working on all scales of project in the city centre. I had significant support from Sean Harrington, who continues to do great work in some of the more challenging areas of the city, and Ali Grain, the then Dublin city architect. In 13 weeks, we were somewhat limited in the amount of consultation we could undertake. We recognise now that maybe the health services could have been involved more. We did get a submission from Irish Doctors for the Environment, which reminded us of the essentials for any healthy city: clean air, clean water, and quality spaces to live and work in. We have since met with the Department of Health to find out more about their Healthy Cities programme. But the recommendations from all our colleagues and groups that we met, and I should say that each of the 13 members of the task force did the same. They consulted with experts and colleagues within their own disciplines. We brought all of these recommendations and fed it into the task force, along with consultations with over 60 other stakeholders representing private and public bodies. I'll bring you through the resulting 10 proposed actions that the task force believes should be implemented immediately. And in our report, we do assign agencies to the various actions. Number one, we need to revitalise O'Connell Street and the surrounding areas. O'Connell Street holds immense historical, cultural and symbolic significance for the city and the country, and some great work has already been done by Dublin City Council in its public realm strategy over the years. And Owen's mentioned this earlier. I was there personally, like some of you, to welcome the Olympic team home last year, and it was fantastic to see the thoroughfare kind of transform itself and be able to take huge crowds. However, we all admit that it's no longer a street, perhaps, that we linger on. It's been described by some as a very large bus stop. The once variety of retail offering is no longer as attractive. There are some long-term vacant sites. No one lives over the shops. Crossing the bridge to the south side is challenging. The task force shares Dublin City Council's vision to lead O'Connell Street into the next century as the physical and emotional heart of our city, or the spine of our city, as Owen called it, a welcoming, accessible and positive space for working, living, visiting, socialising and engaging in a wealth of cultural activities. This requires a step change in how the area is developed. We recommend that the regeneration of the area should be managed as a special programme with a multi-agency mandate. While O'Connell Street is the primary focus, we did recommend that the programme of work should extend from Parnell Square to College Green and include the radial streets on either sides. We know that the Cultural Centre and Library in Parnell Square is a very positive catalyst for that area, and College Green on the south side. And as Owen said, this idea, he alluded to the pulling in of these neighbouring streets to energise our main spine. We do recommend the accelerated rollout of the public realm strategy, and that does include trees and greening and playgrounds. And that's mentioned on page 10. Living over the shop will require some relaxation of the current building regs when it comes to working with existing structures. We are not advocating for any compromise in safety. We know there are studies underway. I started myself, but I don't have a slide to present it today, to compare the building regs in different cities that show how quality apartment living is the norm in other European cities. And it was refreshing to see Paul's example. I lived myself in the centre of Paris for 10 years in a 6-storey building with 1 staircase, no lift, no lobbies, a fire hydrant going up the stairwell, and we lived very, very safely. So it's been mentioned more than once today how challenging it can be to address building regulatory issues in narrow, tall buildings, and that's the typology of building we have in most of our towns and cities. Convincing the owners of the benefits of transforming over the shop into accommodation will require continued financial incentives. We also recommended that the state purchase key vacant sites on the street and that they be redeveloped as quality residential with a preference for frontline workers. For all this to happen, and we allude to it in our final chapter, it will require serious injection of funding and resources. Our second recommendation was to prioritise the total regeneration of social housing complexes in the city centre. This is a no-brainer. The blue dots on this diagram represent social housing regeneration projects currently underway and at various stages with Dublin City Council, sometimes with housing agencies such as Clúid. The slow pace of regeneration is often due to bureaucratic funding and approval processes. We recommend that Exchequer funding be approved immediately and in full, and that Dublin City Council are given sufficient resources to complete these regeneration projects. And by resources, it's funding and people. It's no point giving the same new work, new money to the same people who are already perhaps overextended. We also recommend the inclusion of community facilities and well-designed public spaces in these residential areas to ensure quality of life for residents. This has been high on the agenda of bodies like Inner City Enterprise, the North East Inner City Initiative, and local schools in the area. And Graham Hickey pointed out earlier how inadequate their current funding model is. We need to convert derelict sites into high-density, quality residential with provision for essential workers. There has been some terrific media articles recently highlighting the problem of vacancy and decay in the centre, a problem not unique to Dublin. We are aware of how complex it can be to determine ownership. This was alluded to earlier. I live in Waterford City and we have the same problem identifying who owns what. Whether it's titles or estates, it's extremely complex in some cases. We know also that Dublin City Council does not currently have sufficient funding to buy up these properties. We therefore recommended that Dublin City Council's revolving fund be significantly increased to purchase vacant and derelict sites and adequately resources recruited to transform these properties into quality accommodation for all, with priority given to frontline workers who we need to keep our cities, schools, hospitals and transport systems operational. Supporting frontline workers to live in the city centre closer to the communities they serve will contribute to the economic vitality of the area because there will be a demand for local goods and services. It will also aid a sense of stability and safety and a more cohesive community and neighbourhood. It's blocked on me. Mustn't like number 4. So number 4, we need, it's not my area of expertise, so I can actually go quite quickly through number 4. It's about policing. And I certainly hope we will never get to the level of armed security. Thank you. That one, okay, thank you. This is one thing, and I love Paris for many reasons, but I do hope we will never get to the level of armed security that's present in most of our European cities. Dublin is actually quite a safe city when measured against crime statistics in other cities. However, crime statistics do not show the full picture as much antisocial behaviour falls outside of crime detection. We do know that Dublin falls short of the European average of police to inhabitants, so our report recommends 1,000 new Gardaí along with City Warden programme. With my architect hat on, we know also that people living on the streets have eyes on the street and act as passive surveillance. So by bringing people back into living over the shop, This will also help flush out antisocial behaviour. Thank you.
Is it the right one?
Yes, it is actually. Yeah, thank you. So our fifth recommendation is the need to deliver more targeted and better located services for vulnerable populations in the city centre. This is a sensitive one to talk about. Responding to the needs of our vulnerable population needs the continued work of multi-agencies. What we highlighted in our report is the disproportionate share of emergency accommodation in areas that are already under-resourced, and Graham spoke passionately about this earlier. We recommend a more equitable spread across Greater Dublin and enhanced services, again across Dublin and other cities for drug users. And when we speak about a multi-agency approach, we recognised that Dublin is zoned differently for different agencies. So Dublin City Council has Dublin divided up in a certain way. The Department of Education has Dublin divided up in a different way. The Department of Health has Dublin divided up in a different way. So you need all of those services to work together to create a sustainable community. So that's challenging. Got it this time, pressed harder. Number 6, we need to implement a dedicated waste management plan for the city centre. Again, this was referenced by speakers this morning. I think Paul mentioned urban love of attraction, where litter attracts litter. The cause of litter is multifaceted and public behaviour plays its role. We did learn, however, that one of the biggest contributors to the litter issue is the current system of multiple private providers of waste management services with their own operating processes and collection times. Having multiple providers of waste management services has created complexity and lack of accountability in the centre. Methods of bagging and collection are failing, with bagged waste left on the streets for hours. We also have litter on buildings, be it faulty broken downpipes or ugly service wiring, or more commonly extensive growth growing from chimneys. In Paris, which is mentioned a lot as an exemplar city, building owners are legally obliged to redo their facades every 15 years. This leads to tidy, clean and well-maintained, well-manicured buildings, streets and neighbourhoods. Valerie mentioned this earlier as well. We need to implement the city transport plan. The objective of the Dublin City Plan or Transport Plan is to reduce 60% of car and commercial vehicles that pass through the city. And this one move alone is for the common good, because not only does it reduce traffic congestion, it reduces CO2 emissions, which immediately has positive impact on people's health. It also allows for significant improvement in public realm, greater favouring pedestrians and cyclists, and improving safety for all. And this transport plan, as we know, was nearly postponed due to pressures from different stakeholders. So well done again to Dublin City Council for rolling it out and pushing ahead with sustainable transport. We recommend the implementation of the next phase along with increased nighttime public transport. We need to offer Dubliners compelling reasons to visit the city centre. Despite the rich culture offering, the centre provides too few reasons at times to visit. Suburbia has improved public realm and social offerings, and since COVID there are less people coming in to visit the city centre at night time. The nighttime offering is still centred largely around pubs and restaurants. Safety concerns, lack of public transport contribute to a reluctance to visit the city centre. We propose the development of a meanwhile use strategy and plan to utilise the city's vacant spaces, as is the case in other European cities. Improved visitor corridors between areas of arrival into the city, increased opening hours for cultural institutions, and the expansion of the space to create scheme for artists. We also have to make Dublin attractive to people who visit Dublin. I grew up in Cavan, which was mentioned earlier by Lorcan. It's one of those places like Mullingar and Cavan, but we loved going to Dublin. We always went up to Dublin from Cavan, which probably showed how much we thought of our capital city. try that. No. Oh, there you go. You got it. Yeah. Again, number 9, the narrative of Dublin has become deeply negative. This negative perception is reducing the number of people mainly from Greater Dublin visiting the city. With fewer people, the city feels less safe. Our recommendation is to create a high-level Dublin marketing team to own and manage the brand of Dublin through always-on marketing campaigns, developments of high-quality profile digital platform, and proactive reactive communications. Does not like going forward. Oh, there, I got it. Okay, number 10, governance has been mentioned a lot today. We need to evolve an appropriate governance for Dublin City, which is adequately resourced and funded. Dublin is too complex, too large to be managed by national government alone, and we've seen how little of taxpayers' money goes to Dublin City Council. Much of our report's recommendations stem from previous plans, but the implementation stage is problematic. We need dedicated leadership and devolved decision-making from government departments. We recommend the establishment of a team under the Department of the Taoiseach to drive implementation of the task force plan over 3 years. We are impressed at the transformation of elected mayors such as Anne Hidalgo in Paris, who in less than 10 years has transformed Paris into a greener and healthier city. Her ambition was to create une ville du quart d'heure, a 15-minute city. Some of her successes are noted here: the planting of trees, increased cycleways, reduction of car traffic, reduction of CO2 emissions, improved public realm. I mean, she did have the Olympics as her target, so it was said at one of our meetings, maybe we should imagine that Dublin is going to host the Olympics in 5 years, and would that be the catalyst to get all these great plans implemented? To conclude, a quick update on where we are with the task force. We're very pleased that our 10 recommendations have been included in the programme for government. I mentioned earlier that in our report we attributed each of the recommendations to a specific agency or multi-agency. We know that an interdepartmental group has been formed by the Taoiseach to look at the implementation, and we await perhaps a special purpose group within Dublin City Council, which should be correctly funded and resourced with outside oversight. We feel these 10 moves are interdependent and will lead to a living city with reduced vacancy, improved inclusivity, a better sense of security, reduction in CO2, and improved civic pride. But we are not starting from zero. So much terrific work has already been done. We tend to only hear the negative. We have a beautiful and walkable city centre. Anne Hidalgo sought to create a 15-minute city. We already have a 15-minute city. I have another slide that I didn't present today where I plotted where we have green areas, where we have schools, where we have hospitals, where we have pharmacies, where we have doctor surgeries, not too many bakeries, unfortunately not as many as Paris, but the only thing missing from O'Connell Street is people, and yet we have a huge population in northeast Dublin city centre, which we spoke about earlier. We know what needs to be done to overcome the current challenges, but there are roadblocks with lack of funding, resources, stewardship, perhaps local champions, and proactive urban planning systems. There is perhaps a fear of risk-taking. I mean, we live in such a litigious city or country, and anybody who takes a risk, and if they're wrong and if they're audited, it can be nightmare situations. So I think Anne Hidalgo, she's taken a risk, but she's probably not going to be re-elected in October. So it probably takes people who are willing to take all that criticism and take risks to drive forward. We need innovation in governance, resources, financial incentives, fit-for-purpose building regulations for existing buildings, and above all, a rebalance of social and economic mix in some parts of the city. We did not have time to cost our project, but we do allude to it
You have a panel discussion but if you might indulge us, we have the most wonderful independent observer today here, Olivia Kelly from the Irish Times. And I've invited Olivia in the first instance to give us an overview of today before we might have some questions. Olivia, thank you for taking this task on, if I may hand this over to you.
Not in any way a specialist, I'm not an expert in anything, I'm not a practitioner like most of you today are. So I am not going to try and summarise what all the wonderful speakers have said. Do I need this though? Yes, yeah, keep going with both. But what I'm going to try and do is give you an impression of the things that really struck me from what people said today. And I'll try and do it chronologically, but I may skip back and forth. And also, I won't keep you very long. I'll try and do it in a speedy sort of way. Starting with Valerie, and Valerie was talking about herself and Niall's work. And sadly, the thing that struck me most is how much we have lost over the years. But there was also hope in what she was saying, and there was one phrase she used that struck me. It was that the tiny fragments are worthy of our attention, and that's possibly somewhere we can build from. It struck me a lot in writing about dereliction, is that, you know, doing up, say, one house here, one building here, saving one site here and one building there, that is not really going to add to the store of housing the way a lot of people think or hope it will. But what it can really do is it can lift the impression of a place. It can take us from a street, from something that we see as a lost cause, and maybe give a spark of hope to plough on from. And moving on to Owen then, a lot of what Owen said made me smile because, and probably for the wrong reasons, because he mentioned a lot of projects that I've been writing about for years, that I had naively in my youth thought I would see maybe in a couple of years would be completed. Next year, for example, marks the 20th anniversary of the first, or not next year actually, next month, the 20th anniversary of the first time I wrote about the regeneration of the fruit and vegetable market there just off Capel Street, which I wrote about back then with great enthusiasm, and have written about several times with great enthusiasm, and I wrote about just in the last few months with still great enthusiasm, because I do see now that there is possibly progress to getting that done. There are, you know, a lot of other projects there that Owen mentioned, and I'm going to mention one, South Ann Street, because it crosses over then into what Grania was talking about. Grania mentioned the Metropolitan Streets Commission, and I had been writing about South Ann Street again about a decade ago, because it was part of the Grafton Street Public Realm Plan. But I recently had cause to look for an entirely different reason at the Metropolitan Streets Commission report, and that at that time was recommending that when it was speaking about College Green and possible pedestrianisation there, and what had already happened in Grafton Street at that stage, because it would have been maybe 4 years earlier that Grafton Street was pedestrianised, it spoke about extending the pedestrianisation of Grafton Street out to South Ann Street and Duke Street. And it's just, I think, what were we talking about, 1986? So we're a while on from that yet. And that is maybe coming to fruition, not as a full pedestrianisation project, but to look at that public realm and making it more pedestrian friendly. I'll talk about what Jim and David were presenting to us. What struck me from that was that we have to build neighbourhoods and not just suburbs. And they spoke a lot about different places that offer us prospects, such as the port, and as well such as the Dublin Industrial Estate in Glasnevin. Now, we're again a place that maybe the City Council
had quite a few years ago drawn up plans for the reuse of our industrial lands for housing. And really we've been hearing a lot recently about how we need to rezone more lands. What we definitely don't need in Dublin is rezoning any more green space, because we have these lands, these industrial lands, which already have all the services. We're always hearing that Irish Water can't provide us with, they don't have the resources to provide us with more water connections. These places are already connected to water, already connected to electricity, already have the roads. What they need to be done is repurpose. So I thought that was interesting there. I've already spoken about Grania there, but just another thing that she said was about the importance of persistence and not letting the crisis or the perceived crisis to stop us from pursuing plans, as in not to just throw our hands in the air. Graham, I always find everything Graham says fascinating, but the one thing that really struck me from what he was saying earlier was that on a regular basis you see the innards of Georgian houses in skips. Now, the reason why that really struck me is we all see, and the public all see, the inappropriate PVC windows. They all see maybe the buddleia growing from the roofs. But what they're not seeing, perhaps, is the terrible destruction that's going on inside. And what we're not seeing as well is maybe the enforcement that's needed to stop that destruction happening. It's not believable that there people aren't in authority who don't know that this is going on. And I know they know, because Graham is telling them the whole time about this, that this is going on inside these buildings. And again, bringing it back to what Valerie was saying at the start, how much we might be, not that we've just already lost, but how much we are continuing to lose if this isn't something that's addressed. Nikki then brought a bit of maybe optimism to it, talking about the funding that was going to be available. It was already available through the New European Bauhaus Fund and Thrive. And then we moved on to Dr. Paul, who told us about what we need to offer are compelling reasons for Dubliners to live in the city, and the importance of the aesthetics in the city. It's not just the decoration, it's not just the icing on the cake. It is what makes people want to live in a place. Who did we have next? We had Gavin. And, oh yes, so Gavin had an awful lot to say, and what struck me from that was something that's quite nuanced is people confusing supply and provision, that it's not always the same thing, and that's something we need to question. And I'm going to move on then to Lorcan. Lorcan was talking about how Dublin has been shaped by an anti-city ethos, and that there's been almost zero new homes brought to the market that are actually homes for sale in Dublin rather than homes for rent, and that's one of the reasons why we're seeing people, as we've seen obviously over decades, but it's something we haven't been able to reverse, is that people fleeing to the suburbs, fleeing to Cavan and those surrounding counties. And as well, another point he made there is that local authorities shouldn't have to be going cap in hand to the government every time they want to build a house. And that's something I'm going to come back to later, because it was a thread, that funding and that resources that sort of flow through a lot of things. Moving on to Alistair then, and Alistair and Paul Arnold both also gave us cause for optimism. Alistair in the sense of what can be achieved from engaging with communities, and then Paul in the sense of what can be achieved with people getting together and developing affordable housing. Making something anti-speculative. I know we do have our notions of cooperative housing, and we do for people who wouldn't have the wherewithal then to maybe pursue that themselves. We have the new cost rental model, but it really shows us what can be achieved in other models in other countries. Then finally, Máire, I was very enthused by the Dublin Task Force when it came out. I think the recommendations of it are excellent recommendations. You could say they're mom and apple pie and they're what everyone knows we need to do for the city, but the point of what has happened here, it's collating them and it's ascribing them to different actors to actually achieve them. But the problem here, and it was referenced several times, is resources. And that's in terms of monetary resources, but it's in terms of people resources. And I said I was going to come back to something earlier on, and it's in terms of one of the elements of the task force is that regeneration of social housing. And I'm just going to give you an example of something that the council planned back a decade ago in 2015. And that was the regeneration of Pierce House, a Sims building. And then they devised their plans, which would, involve no demolition, because there was a bit of a call for demolition of the building because it's in such rag order initially. And then they devised plans that would avoid demolition. And then they presented, so that was 10 years ago, and then they formulated the plans for the first phase, and then they went through the government funding process, and they've come back with a no. So all that time wasted to come back with a no, and the reason they've come back with a no is because there isn't additionality, as it's called. They're not getting extra units. So it's very hard to see how that is going to change. I would like to think it's going to change, but it's very hard to see that impetus for change. There's, that is the real problem here, and it's the thought I'm going to leave you with. It was mentioned here today, earlier on today, that who are the people in the room? Who are the decision makers here today? The economists aren't in the room, the politicians are in the room. So everyone here, I would say, is working with great enthusiasm and is working with your specialists, your experts in your field. But what I want to know is who is listening to you and who has the power to implement your great ideas. And I hope in saying that I'm not ending on a pessimistic note, but I really think that is the important takeaway, that we really need to see who is going to resource what needs to be done.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Olivia. If you indulge me in not having questions for our final panelists, but you can circulate them just after my summation remarks. Much of today resonated with me personally as a Southside suburban boy, Braston Mayor Scully, Lorna Potter, Garnet Farnell, Shopping in Vish. I attended school in the city centre at Parnell Square from the age of 7. Subsequently, was at college in school at Bolton Street, DIT, and then King's Inns later on. What really resonated with me today was our first speaker, and Valerie, bringing the spirit of Neil McCullough here, and talking about Neil visiting the debtors' jail and people waiting for their food to be delivered. I was one of those delivery boys. We did meals on feet in those days in secondary school, and I remember bringing dinner at lunchtime to a man called Frank Ennis in his wheelchair in the debtors' jail, which had no disability access or whatever. I don't know how Frank got in and out with minimal sanitary facilities. We've come a long way, but we've also slipped along the way today. Today has been about crisis and opportunities, and I do hope, as Olivia says, that the energy of this room will be captured, because the message needs to be disseminated further. I could rehearse, and I will not, all the incredibly important issues that have come to us today. But there's one, again, resonating remark, and it was Gráinne Shaffery saying, "Don't give up." And I think that's kind of fundamental in terms of the energy that's here. My task really is to thank everybody who brought today together.
Graham and the Dublin Civic Trust and Alexander. If you don't follow Graham on Instagram, please do. His photo library is just quite extraordinary. In the IGS, to Emmeline and the team here, and our committee for architectural conservation and preservation, to the department, who are so fundamentally important to us in all the work we do, and to those who attended from the department today. We really very much appreciate it. We had wonderful engagement with the Minister for Brute Heritage the other day, and he really understands, I believe, what we're about. So we're ever hopeful in terms of dissemination at a higher level of government in terms of what we do. I really want to thank our speakers who put an incredible amount of research and effort into what they do today. Inspirational, optimistic, pessimistic, all. But most of all, I'd like to thank all of you, the participants, who made the time to endure the wonderful and enjoy the wonderful experience that we had today. And then finally, I always have to have a plug for the Irish Georgian Society. If you're not a member, please visit igs.ie or capture the QR code. And we're not just about scholarship, we're about fun as well, as you discovered. Thank you very, very much.